Okay, so we've looked at how to use the PowerShell suggested questions and also how to do so with Z Shell. Now I want to dive into the implementation. And the first thing I want to do is look at how I set this up inside of PowerShell. And then in the next video, I'll go over how I set this up inside of Z Shell. The PowerShell version is a bit easier to understand, so we're going to start with that first. All right, so this feature of asking a question like help me list big files, and then hitting Control B to ask, getting a response back eventually from OpenAI, and then overriding the buffer with the suggested command. So this is what I'm going to explain in this video, how these steps are actually carried out to make that request and then update the response right here inside the terminal, so it's all inline inside of PowerShell. All right, so first up, let's take a look at what's known as a key binding or a key handler. So there's get ps readline key handler. If I run that, there are some user-defined functions down at the bottom that I've set up here. You can see Control B is mapped to this ask OpenAI to generate a command. So this is a function that I've defined. When Control B is typed, this function is then invoked. And then the source for this function is actually available inside of a GitHub repository. If you hop out to G0T4 and then /dot files, and then inside of there, you'll see there's a PowerShell directory. Change into that, and then into the helpers directory. Inside of here is my PowerShell script to ask OpenAI. So if I go ahead and open this up inside of VS Code, we can take a look at this. All right, so first up, I'm setting a PS readline key handler here. And I'm specifying that for the chord Control B, I want the script block I then define at the end here. I want all of this to be invoked. And then what we have here is a first function call to get the buffer. This will return back the user input that I typed, which would be the question. And then right away, I append onto the end of the input the word thinking ... after which I then make a request to send off to OpenAI. And that request has a context you can think of, which is the question, as well as the fact that we're sitting inside of a PowerShell environment. That way I want it to generate a command for PowerShell. I then take that context or question, I start up a Python process, and I call into a Python script here that gets me back a single suggestion. I take the context and I pass that to standard in, hence the write output, and then piping that to Python. And then whatever comes back in the output, that gets stored into this output variable. So when I get back a suggested command, it'll be sitting inside that output variable. After that, if I scroll down here, essentially the next thing I call here is this last set of lines to replace the buffer, basically to overwrite whatever the user typed with the suggested command. And then I have some logic in here to handle a failure and some troubleshooting. In those cases, it will also just replace whatever the user typed with the failure message or the context for troubleshooting. Now, as far as that Python script is concerned, if I hop out to the files here in the Z Shell directory, there's an ask OpenAI directory, and inside of there is a single .py. So the first thing I'm doing here is I'm getting access to an API key. I'm storing that either in Windows Credential Manager or on macOS inside of the keychain. If I fail to find a key, of course, I return back that the password was not found, and then that will actually show in the command line. But assuming all goes well, I then build a client to access the OpenAI API, and I call into the completions endpoint and ask to create a completion. And in this case, I'm using GPT-4-1106 preview, which is actually GPT-4 Turbo. And then to that endpoint, I need to specify some messages, the first of which is going to be a system message. And in this case, I'm specifying that I need a command line expert. So the assistant, if you will, that I'm talking to, you are a command line expert. Please respond with a single, valid, complete command line, one that I intend to execute. I don't want any explanation, and I don't want any markdown blocks. And then after that, I provide the context, which is going to be the question, as well as the environment, which is PowerShell. So that goes into the user message, which would be like if you typed a message into the ChatGPT website. Once that's complete, I get back a message that's extracted and returned. Basically, that's printed out to the command line. That happens down below. It's not that important, though. At the end of the day, if I close this and come back to my Ask PowerShell script, scroll up here, at the end of the day, the output is captured into this output variable.